Picture this. You walk into a restaurant, sit down and open the menu. Tonight's specials: grilled wolf steaks with rosemary butter, crispy fried eagle wings, bear ribs slow roasted for 12 hours, and for the truly adventurous pan-seared tiger medallions with a side of roasted lion. Your stomach turns just reading it, right? But why? These are all meat. They're all protein. Many of them are probably delicious if prepared correctly. Yet something deep in your brain is screaming that this is fundamentally wrong. Here's the weird part. Walk into any grocery store on Earth, and you'll find beef, chicken, pork, lamb, fish. All herbivores are animals that eat things lower on the food chain. The meat section is packed with plant eaters, but predators, carnivores, the animals that eat other animals, they're nowhere to be found. Not because they're illegal, not because they taste bad. They're just absent. This isn't a coincidence. It's not cultural preference. It's not even really a choice we consciously made. Humans across every continent, every culture, every time period have independently arrived at the same conclusion. We don't eat meat eaters, or at least we almost never do. And when we do, there's usually a very specific reason, which we'll get to later. Now you might be thinking, okay, so we prefer herbivores. Big deal. Maybe predator meat tastes worse. Maybe it's tougher. Maybe it's just tradition. But here's what'll blow your mind. There's a hidden mathematical law governing this choice. A rule so fundamental to how energy moves through ecosystems that it determines not just what we eat, but how many lions can exist, why food chains stop where they do, and even why life on Earth looks the way it does. Scientists call it the 10% rule, and it's one of the most elegant yet brutal truths in all of ecology. Think about every meal you've ever eaten, every burger, every chicken wing, every fish fillet. Behind each bite is an invisible calculation that's been running for billions of years, an energy equation that shapes the entire living world. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. You'll understand why farmers raise millions of cows, but nobody farms tigers. Why there are way more rabbits than wolves. Why predators are rare, expensive, and from an energy perspective, a terrible thing to eat. But here's the mystery that makes this whole thing fascinating. Humans eat almost everything. We're arguably the least picky species on the planet. We eat insects, we eat plants, we eat fungi, we eat things that would kill most other animals. We've figured out how to make poisonous plant edible. We consume dairy from other species, something almost no other animal does. We eat raw fish, fermented cabbage, moldy cheese, and we call it cuisine. Our species has basically looked at the entire biological world and said, yes, I'll try that, except when it comes to predators. There we draw a line. Nearly every human culture independently decided that eating carnivores wasn't worth it. That's not random. That's not superstition. That's our ancestors figuring out something profound about how nature works, long before anyone knew about ecology or energy pyramids or trophic levels. So what did they figure out? What's the secret hidden in the mathematics of the food chain? Why does eating a predator violate some invisible rule that eating a cow doesn't? The answer takes us deep into the fundamental laws of energy, into the economics of evolution, and into the surprising logic of prehistoric humans who somehow understood things about nature that scientists didn't formally discover until the 1940s. This is about more than just food. It's about why ecosystems are shaped like pyramids, why there's always more prey than predators, why energy gets more expensive the higher you climb, and ultimately why a lion steak, even if you could get one, represents one of the most wasteful, impractical, potentially dangerous meals you could ever choose. By the time we're done, you're going to see your dinner plate completely differently. You'll understand the invisible energy tax that every living thing pays. You'll know why being at the top of the food chain is both awesome and incredibly expensive. and you'll never look at a hamburger the same way again. Because that hamburger, it's not just food, it's proof that your ancestors were better at math than they ever knew. Before we can understand why humans don't eat predators, we need to talk about something more fundamental, something so basic, so universally true, that it governs not just what you eat for dinner, but the entire structure of life on Earth. We need to talk about energy, and specifically, we need to talk about the universe's most inflexible rule. Energy always has a cost. Every meal you've ever eaten, every calorie you've ever consumed, every bit of fuel that's kept your body running, it all came from the same source, the sun. Now that might sound obvious when we're talking about vegetables, maybe even intuitive for meat from herbivores. But here's what most people don't realize. That chicken wing you had last night, those salmon fillets in your freezer, that steak you're planning for the weekend, all of it, every molecule started as sunlight hitting a plant somewhere. The sun is the bank, and everything else is just moving money around, taking its cut at every transaction. Let me show you how this works. 93 million miles away, the sun is burning through nuclear fusion, converting hydrogen into helium and releasing absolutely staggering amounts of energy in the process. Some of that energy, a tiny fraction, travels across space and hits Earth. Most of it bounces off, warms the atmosphere, or gets absorbed by oceans. But some of it, maybe 1% or 2%, hits something extraordinary. It hits a plant. And this is where the magic happens. Plants have figured out something remarkable, something that took billions of years of evolution to perfect. They can capture sunlight, trap it using molecules of chlorophyll, and use that trapped energy to build sugar molecules out of air and water. This is photosynthesis, nature's original solar panel technology. And it's the foundation of everything. Think about it. A blade of grass sitting in a field is performing a feat that human technology still can't match efficiently. It's taking diffuse low-grade energy from sunlight and converting it into chemical energy stored in sugar molecules. Those sugar molecules are like batteries, portable energy storage that can be used later, moved around, transformed. Every plant on Earth is basically a living solar farm, quietly converting sunlight into usable energy hour after hour, day after day. But here's the problem. Photosynthesis isn't very efficient. Of all the sunlight that hits a plant, only about 1% to 2% actually gets converted into chemical energy that the plant can use. The rest, lost as heat, reflected away, used for other processes that don't create storable energy. So right from the start, we're dealing with massive energy losses. If the sun were a bank account with $1 million, plants would be capturing maybe 10,000. Now, plants don't use all that captured energy to grow tissues that animals can eat. They have to spend energy on their own survival, growing roots, maintaining cellular processes, reproducing, defending against diseases. Maybe 10% of the energy they capture from sunlight actually gets stored in plant tissues like leaves, stems, fruits, and seeds. The rest gets burned off through the plant's own metabolism. So now we're down to about $1,000 from that original $1 million. This is where the food chain, or as ecologists call it, the trophic pyramid begins. Plants occupy the first trophic level. They're the primary producers, the only organisms on Earth that can create food energy from scratch using sunlight. Everything else, every animal, every fungus, every bacterium that can't photosynthesize, is a consumer. We're all living off the energy that plants captured from the sun. The second trophic level belongs to herbivores. These are your deer, rabbits, cows, grasshoppers, anything that eats plants directly. And this is where things get really interesting, because this is where the universe starts demanding its tax in earnest. When a rabbit eats grass, it doesn't get to keep all the energy stored in that grass, not even close. Most of the plant material passes right through the rabbit's digestive system without being absorbed. Cellulose, the The tough structural material that makes up plant cell walls is incredibly hard to break down. Rabbits have special adaptations to digest it, but even they can't extract all the energy. Then there's the energy the rabbit uses just to live. Moving around, maintaining body temperature, growing fur, fighting off infections, finding mates. All of that requires energy. Energy that gets burned off as heat and lost to the environment forever. When you add it all up, when you account for all the losses from digestion, metabolism, and basic survival, here's what you discover. The rabbit only converts about 10% of the plant energy it consumes into rabbit biomass. Only 10% becomes rabbit meat, rabbit organs, rabbit tissues that could potentially feed something else. The other 90% is gone, burned off, excreted, radiated away as heat. So let's do the math. That $1 million of sunlight became $10,000 of plant energy. The plant used 90% for itself, leaving $1,000 of edible plant tissue. The rabbit ate that plant tissue and converted only 10% into rabbit biomass. Now we're down to $100. The losses are staggering. But wait, it gets worse, because the rabbit is food for something else. A fox, let's say, or a coyote. These are carnivores, predators that occupy the third trophic level, and when that fox catches and eats the rabbit, these same brutal mathematics apply. The fox's digestive system isn't perfectly efficient. Much of the rabbit passes through undigested. The fox uses enormous amounts of energy hunting, defending territory, staying warm during winter. Maybe 10% of the rabbit's energy gets converted into fox biomass, from $100 down to $10. This is the 10% rule. At each step up the food chain, roughly 90% of the energy is lost. Only about 10% makes it to the next level. It's not exact. Some ecosystems are slightly more efficient, others less so, but 10% is the average that ecologists use. And it's this rule, this fundamental constraint imposed by the laws of thermodynamics, that determines the entire structure of life on Earth. You can see this play out in any ecosystem. Take an African savanna. You need maybe 10,000 pounds of grass to support 1,000 pounds of zebra, which can support 100 pounds of lion. The pyramid narrows dramatically at each level because the energy losses are so massive, there's simply not enough energy to support more predators than that. The math won't allow it. This is why predators are always rare compared to their prey. It's not because they're bad at reproducing or unlucky. It's because the energy budget of the universe demands it. For every lion on the savannah, there need to be dozens of zebras. For every zebra, there need to be thousands of pounds of grass. The pyramid has to work this way. There's no alternative. And here's where it connects to our original question. Here's where it starts to explain why you've never seen lion steaks at the grocery store. Because if you want to eat a predator, you're eating from the third trophic level. You're eating something that represents only 10% of 10% of the original energy. You're eating the most expensive food, energetically speaking, that exists. Before we go further into what this means for human food choices, I'm curious. Where are you watching this from? What time is it where you are right now? Drop a comment. I love seeing this community spread across different time zones, all of us exploring these same questions together about why the world works the way it does. Because what we're really talking about here isn't just about food. It's about the fundamental architecture of life itself. The sun gives. Plants take and lose most of it. Herbivores take from plants and lose most of it. Predators take from herbivores and lose most of it. At each step, the universe extracts its tax. At each level, 90% disappears into entropy. And humans, sitting at the top of this pyramid, looking down at all the options, had to make a choice that would be shaped entirely by this brutal mathematics of energy loss. A choice that would determine not just what we eat, but how we built civilization itself. But to understand that choice, we need to dig deeper into what the 10% rule really means. We need to see exactly why eating predators isn't just unusual, it's mathematically absurd. Let's get brutal about energy. Not the feel-good, everything is connected kind of energy talk you get in nature documentaries. The cold, hard mathematics that determines who lives, who dies, and why there are no lion farms. Picture 1,000 pounds of grass, beautiful, green, photosynthesizing grass soaking up sunlight on an African savanna. A herd of zebras comes along and eats it, all of it. Every blade, every stem, every leaf. Now here's the question that changes everything. How much zebra do you get? If nature were fair, if energy transfer were perfect, you'd get 1,000 pounds of zebra. Grass goes in, zebra comes out, conservation of mass, everybody's happy. But nature isn't fair. Nature is a cosmic accountant with the worst exchange rate in the universe. You get roughly 100 pounds of zebra. That's it. 10%. What happened to the other 900 pounds? Where did 90% of your grass go? It vanished into the most expensive biological processes in existence, staying alive. Let's follow one blade of grass through a zebra's digestive system and watch the energy disappear like money at a casino. First, the zebra has to find the grass. That requires movement. Walking, running, looking around, fleeing from lions who haven't eaten in a week. Every step burns energy. Every muscle contraction converts chemical energy into motion and heat. Lots of heat. Then comes chewing. Zebras are constantly chewing because grass is incredibly difficult to break down. Those powerful jaw muscles working hour after hour, grinding plant matter into digestible pulp. More energy gone. More heat released into the African air. Now the grass enters the digestive system, and this is where things get really expensive. Breaking down cellulose, the tough structural material in plant cell walls, requires an enormous investment. Zebras can't digest cellulose on their own. Nobody can, really. They need help from billions of bacteria living in their guts. These bacteria break down the cellulose, but they're not doing it for free. They take their cut. A big cut. They use much of the energy for their own reproduction and metabolism. The nutrients that finally get absorbed have already been taxed multiple times. The zebra's cells grab what they can and convert it into useful molecules. ATP, the currency of cellular energy. But this conversion process itself isn't efficient. Energy is lost as heat. Always heat. The second law of thermodynamics doesn't make exceptions for zebras. Then comes maintenance. The zebra has to maintain its body temperature roughly 100 degrees Fahrenheit in an environment that swings from freezing nights to scorching days. This is brutally expensive. Every degree of temperature difference between the zebra and its environment represents energy constantly being lost. The zebra is a furnace that never stops burning. The zebra's immune system needs energy to fight off parasites, bacteria, viruses, all the microscopic assassins trying to make it their home. Its nervous system needs energy to process sensory information, coordinate movement, respond to threats. Its heart needs energy to pump blood through miles of vessels. Its kidneys need energy to filter waste. Its liver needs energy to detoxify compounds. Every cellular process, every chemical reaction, every moment of existence burns through the energy that came from that grass. And most of it becomes heat, always heat, radiating out into the environment, warming the air around the zebra, serving no biological purpose except as an unavoidable tax on being alive. By the time the zebra builds new muscle, repairs damaged tissue, or stores a little fat for lean times, maybe 10% of the original grass energy remains incorporated into its body. The rest is gone, burned, lost, converted into the entropy that the universe demands as payment for every biological transaction. Now, a lion comes along and kills the zebra. eats 100 pounds of zebra meat, and the same brutal mathematics plays out again. The lion gets maybe 10 pounds of new lion. The rest? Heat, movement, digestion. The constant expensive burden of staying alive in a body that never stops breaking down and needs constant repair. This is the 10% rule. And it's not really a rule so much as a rough average that describes the greatest constraint on life in the universe. Energy flows through ecosystems like water through a sieve with holes that get bigger at every level. By the time you reach the third level of consumption, predators eating predators, you're down to 1% of the original energy. By the fourth level, you're at 0.1%. This creates what ecologists call the energy pyramid. It's exactly what it sounds like. A pyramid with producers, plants and photosynthesizers at the bottom, herbivores in the middle, and carnivores at the top. Each level is roughly 1/10 the size of the level below it. Not because of some mystical balance of nature, but because basic physics makes any other arrangement impossible. The discovery of this principle transformed ecology from a descriptive science into a predictive one. The breakthrough came in 1942 from an ecologist named Raymond Lindemann. He was studying a small lake in Minnesota, carefully measuring the energy flow between different organisms: plants, zooplankton, fish, bigger fish. What he found was consistent efficiency across different levels, about 10% of energy transferring from one level to the next. Lindemann died tragically young at 27, shortly after publishing his findings. He didn't live to see his work revolutionize ecology, but his paper, The Trophic Dynamic Aspect of Ecology, gave scientists a framework for understanding why ecosystems look the way they do, why predators are always rare compared to their prey, why food chains rarely exceed 4 or 5 levels, why the mass of all plants on Earth vastly exceeds the mass of all animals. Now, the 10% figure isn't exact. It's an average that hides significant variation. Some transfers are more efficient, reaching 20%. Others are less efficient, dropping to 5% or even lower. The efficiency depends on what's being eaten and who's doing the eating. Cold-blooded animals are generally more efficient than warm-blooded ones. A snake can convert 30 to 40% of its food into body mass because it doesn't waste energy maintaining constant body temperature. It just sits there, occasionally moving, occasionally digesting, spending weeks between meals. For a snake, being alive is relatively cheap. Warm-blooded animals, mammals and birds pay an enormous premium for the privilege of staying warm. A mouse might convert only 2 to 3% of its food into growth because it's constantly burning energy to maintain its tiny body at mammalian temperature. Small warm-blooded animals are catastrophically inefficient. They're essentially tiny furnaces with legs, burning through resources at ridiculous rates just to avoid freezing to death. This is why most predators humans encounter are warm-blooded mammals like ourselves. And it's why eating them makes even less economic sense than the baseline 10% rule would suggest. A lion isn't just one step up the energy ladder, it's one step up the most inefficient version of the energy ladder. The energy content of lion meat represents maybe 1 to 2% of the energy in the plants that fed the zebras that fed the lion. To get 1 pound of lion, you need to grow roughly 5,100 pounds of plant matter. Compare that to getting 1 pound of zebra, which only requires 10 pounds of plant matter. The math is brutal and unforgiving. But it gets worse. The 10% rule doesn't just affect energy transfer between species, it affects everything about how ecosystems function. It determines how many lions a savanna can support, how much territory each predator needs, how long predators can go without eating. A lion needs a hunting territory of 20 square miles or more, not because lions are territorial jerks, but because physics demands it. There simply isn't enough energy concentrated in prey populations to support more lions in less space. This is why predators spend so much time doing nothing. Lions sleep 20 hours a day. They're not lazy. They're energy efficient. Every hour spent doing something burns through their precious reserves that are already limited by the mathematics of energy transfer. When a lion does hunt, it's a calculated risk. The energy cost of a hunt, the sprinting, the fighting, the potential injuries, might exceed the energy gained from a kill if the hunt fails. Lions succeed in only about 30% of their hunts. The other 70% represent pure energy loss. No wonder they only hunt when they're really hungry. The 10% rule also explains why apex predators are so vulnerable to extinction. They exist at the tip of the energy pyramid, supported by an enormous base of plants and herbivores. Disturb that base, reduce the herbivore population by half, and you don't just reduce predator numbers by half, you might eliminate them entirely. There's no buffer, no safety margin. The energy available at the top of the pyramid is already at the bare minimum needed to support predator reproduction and survival. This is the brutal mathematics that governs every ecosystem on Earth. From the smallest pond to the largest ocean, from tropical rainforest to Arctic tundra, the 10% rule shapes what lives, how many can live, and what they can eat. It's not a suggestion, it's not a guideline, it's thermodynamics, and thermodynamics doesn't negotiate. And it's exactly this brutal mathematics that made our ancestors look at predator meat and think, not worth it. But to understand why they made that choice, and why we still live with its consequences, we need to look at what it actually means to be a predator in a world governed by the 10% rule. Because the mathematics gets even more brutal from here. So here's where things get really interesting. That 10% rule we just talked about. It doesn't just make meat eaters energetically inefficient to farm and eat. It creates what ecologists call the predator's curse, a fundamental constraint that shapes every ecosystem on Earth. Let's do some actual energy accounting. Imagine you want a pound of lion meat. Not that you can legally get it, but work with me here. That pound of lion required the lion to eat roughly 10 pounds of antelope. Those 10 pounds of antelope required the antelopes to eat about 100 pounds of grass. So your 1 pound of lion meat represents 100 pounds of grass, filtered through 2 energy-destroying steps. Now compare that to getting a pound of antelope meat directly. That only required 10 pounds of grass. Same nutritional value to you, 1/10 the primary production required. From a pure energy economics perspective, eating the lion is burning through 10 times more of the ecosystem's solar energy budget for the exact same result. But here's what makes this really profound. This isn't just about what's efficient to eat. This energy constraint determines how many predators can even exist in the first place. Think about the Serengeti. That vast African grassland supports roughly 1.3 million wildebeest, 200,000 zebras, 500,000 gazelles, millions of large herbivores, massive herds that stretch to the horizon during migration season. You know how many lions the same ecosystem supports? About 3,000, that's it. 3,000 lions trying to make a living off millions of herbivores, and it has to be that way. There's simply not enough energy flowing through the system to support more predators. If lion populations doubled, they wouldn't find twice as much food. They'd just crash twice as hard when they depleted their prey base. This creates what biologists call a biomass pyramid. At the bottom, you have massive amounts of plant matter, tons and tons of grass covering the landscape. One step up, you have less biomass of herbivores, maybe 10% as much. Another step up, even less biomass of predators, maybe 10% of the herbivore level. The pyramid gets narrower and narrower as you climb, not because of some cosmic preference for plants, but because of pure thermodynamics. Energy lost as heat at every step, less available to support the next level. You can actually measure this. In a typical grassland ecosystem, you might have 10,000 kilograms of plant biomass per hectare. That supports maybe 1,000 kilograms of herbivore biomass. which in turn supports maybe 100 kilograms of predator biomass. The numbers vary depending on the ecosystem, the climate, the specific species involved, but the basic pattern holds everywhere. The higher you go, the less life the system can support. This is why apex predators are always rare. Not sometimes rare, not rare because they're hunted or their habitat is destroyed, though those things certainly don't help, but fundamentally, intrinsically rare, because there's no other possibility. The universe's energy tax makes it mathematically impossible for predators to be common. Lions, tigers, wolves, bears, killer whales, great white sharks, eagles, every apex predator you can name exists in tiny numbers compared to their prey. They have to. Their lifestyle is so energetically expensive that only a handful of individuals can make it work in any given area. And here's where it gets brutal. Those small population numbers make predators incredibly vulnerable to any disruption. A bad drought that kills off prey animals? Predator populations crash immediately. They can't just eat less and wait it out. They need huge territories and constant hunting success just to break even energetically. When prey declines, predators don't gradually decrease. They collapse. This happened in Yellowstone after wolves were eradicated in the 1920s. The elk population exploded without predation pressure, overgrazed the vegetation, and then crashed when they depleted their food supply. When wolves were reintroduced in 1995, the ecosystem began rebalancing, but it took decades. The wolves couldn't just show up and immediately establish stable populations. They had to work within the energy constraints, building their numbers slowly as the prey base recovered and vegetation regrew. Now, there are some fascinating exceptions to the pyramid rule. In aquatic ecosystems, especially in the open ocean, you sometimes see what looks like an inverted pyramid. More biomass of predators than the prey supporting them. How is that possible? Doesn't it violate thermodynamics? It doesn't, but it requires understanding timescales. In the ocean, the primary producers are phytoplankton, microscopic algae that bloom and die in days or weeks. The predators eating them, zooplankton, are also small and short-lived. But the predators eating those and the predators eating those can be long-lived fish that accumulate biomass over years or decades. At any given moment, you might measure more fish biomass than phytoplankton biomass. But if you measure productivity over time, the energy flow still follows the 10% rule. The phytoplankton are producing vastly more total biomass than the fish. They're just turning over so fast you don't see it all at once. It's like comparing a savings account to a paycheck. Your bank balance might be $10,000, but your annual income is $50,000. The income is higher, even though at any snapshot the savings looks bigger. Ocean ecosystems work the same way. Productivity matters more than standing biomass when you're measuring energy flow. But back on land, where we're trying to figure out what to eat, the pyramid rule dominates, and it creates some interesting secondary effects. Predator populations don't just need energy to survive, they need space. Because their prey are spread across landscapes, predators need enormous territories to find enough food. A single male lion needs about 20 square kilometers of territory. A breeding pride needs 100 or more. Wolves need even larger ranges, up to 2,500 square kilometers, for a pack in areas where prey is scarce. These aren't optional requirements. They're direct consequences of the energy math. Spread your prey across space. Predators must spread themselves even more thinly to survive. This spatial constraint compounds the energy constraint. Even if there were somehow enough energy to support more predators, there isn't enough space. Predators would spend all their time fighting each other over territories instead of hunting. In fact, that's exactly what happens when predator populations temporarily spike. Territorial conflicts increase, weaker individuals get excluded from good hunting grounds, and populations self-regulate back down to what the energy flow can sustainably support. Your prehistoric ancestors would have understood this intuitively. They lived in the ecosystem, watched predator and prey populations rise and fall, learned through generations of observation which animals were common enough to hunt reliably and which were too rare to bother with. They didn't need ecology textbooks to realize that hunting lions was a waste of effort. Lions were hard to find, dangerous to kill, and didn't taste any better than the abundant zebras and antelopes sharing the same territory. But they would have noticed something else too, something that made the choice even clearer. Predators weren't just rare. They were often actively dangerous to eat, even if you could catch them. And that's where our story takes an even darker turn, into the realm of toxins, parasites, and the hidden chemistry of the food chain. But we'll get to that next. For now, just remember this. The predator's curse isn't bad luck or evolutionary disadvantage. It's simple mathematics. Every ecosystem on Earth is running on a fixed energy budget provided by the sun. That energy gets taxed 90% at every step up the food chain. By the time you reach apex predators, there's so little energy left that only a handful of individuals can survive. They're rare because they have to be, and that rarity, combined with the energy cost of producing their meat, makes them terrible candidates for human food, unless you're willing to burn through 10 times more solar energy for the same nutritional result. Which, it turns out, our ancestors wisely were not. Picture yourself 40,000 years ago. 1,000. You're standing at the edge of a grassland in what's now southern France. The sun's coming up, frost glittering on the ground, your breath visible in the cold air. You're hungry. Your family's hungry. And you need to make a decision that could mean the difference between eating today or going to bed with an empty stomach again. You've got options. Through the morning mist, you can see a small herd of reindeer, about half a mile away, 6 or 7 animals grazing peacefully, unaware of your presence. They're big, maybe 300 pounds of meat each if you can bring one down. Your mouth waters just thinking about it. But then you hear something else, a howl, distant but clear. Wolves. Maybe a pack of them, judging by the chorus. And where there are wolves, there might be a fresh kill, something you could scavenge. Or you could hunt the wolves themselves. They're meat, after all, protein, calories your family desperately needs. So what do? Which option gives you the best chance of survival? This isn't a hypothetical question. Your ancestors faced this exact calculation thousands of times. And the choices they made, the pattern of decisions repeated across millennia, shape not just what we eat today, but how we think about food at the most fundamental level. Let's run the numbers the way your prehistoric brain would have. Not with mathematics, obviously, your ancestors didn't have spreadsheets, but with a kind of intuitive cost-benefit analysis, refined by hundreds of thousands of years of natural selection. Option 1, the reindeer. They're herbivores, which means they're relatively predictable. They move in herds, following seasonal patterns your people have observed for generations. They're focused on eating, not on hunting, which means they're less alert to threats. Most importantly, they're abundant. Where there's one herd, there are usually others. If you fail today, you can try again tomorrow. The risks? Reindeer are fast and they can be dangerous if cornered. Those antlers aren't decorative, but your people have been hunting them for tens of thousands of years. You know their behavior patterns. You know where they water, where they bed down, how they react to threats. You've got strategies that work. Drive them toward a cliff. Separate a weak individual from the herd. Wait near their migration routes. The success rate isn't perfect. Maybe you only succeed 1 time in 5. But when you do succeed, you're feeding your family for days. Now option 2, the wolves. They're predators, which changes everything. They're alert, constantly scanning for threats because they live in a world where being caught off guard means death. They're intelligent, social animals with complex communication systems. They hunt in packs using coordinated strategies. They're fast, aggressive, and they've got teeth and claws designed to kill animals much larger than you. But let's say you're a skilled hunter. Let's say you've got a good spear and the courage to face down a wolf. What's your reward? An adult wolf weighs maybe 80 pounds, less than a third of a reindeer. And that's total body weight, not all of it is edible. You're looking at maybe 30 pounds of actual meat if you're lucky. For comparison, that reindeer could give you 200 pounds or more. The math gets worse. Wolves are rare compared to herbivores. That's just ecology, the 10% rule we talked about earlier. For every wolf in the territory, there might be dozens of reindeer. So not only is the wolf harder to hunt and provides less food, it's also harder to find in the first place. And we haven't even talked about the danger. Hunting a wolf means confronting an animal that's evolved specifically to kill. Even if you win, even if you bring it down, you might be injured in the process. A bite, a deep scratch, in a world without antibiotics, that's a potential death sentence. Is 30 pounds of meat worth risking your life when there are 300-pound reindeer standing right over there? Your ancestors weren't stupid. They understood this calculus instinctively. And we know what choices they made because they left evidence everywhere. Archaeological sites across Europe, Africa, Asia, the Americas, they all tell the same story. The bone assemblages at human camps are overwhelmingly herbivores. Reindeer, bison, wild horses, aurochs, deer, antelope, wild sheep. Site after site, continent after continent, the pattern repeats. Our ancestors were killing and eating the plant eaters, not the meat eaters. At some sites, we find almost no carnivore bones at all. At others, we find carnivore bones, but they show different cut marks than the herbivore bones. The herbivores were butchered systematically, every scrap of meat removed, bones cracked open for marrow. The carnivores? Often just skinned. The fur was valuable, the meat wasn't worth the trouble. There are exceptions, and we'll get to those, but the overwhelming pattern is clear. Human hunters focused their efforts on herbivores, and this pattern held true across vastly different environments and cultures. In the frozen north, Paleolithic hunters pursued mammoth, reindeer, and musk ox. In temperate forests, they hunted deer and wild boar. In grasslands, bison and antelope. On coastlines, they shifted to seals and sea lions, marine mammals that, crucially, are also primarily eating things lower on the food chain, fish and krill, not other predators. This convergent behavior across different human populations is remarkable. People who had no contact with each other, living in radically different environments, independently reached the same conclusion. Don't waste time hunting predators when there are perfectly good herbivores available. But why? We've talked about the energetics, but there's another factor that ancient humans understood implicitly: opportunity. Herbivores are everywhere because plants are everywhere. A landscape can support vastly more plant eaters than meat eaters. Walk through a prehistoric forest or grassland, and you'd encounter herbivores constantly. Tracks, droppings, grazing damage, the signs were everywhere. You didn't have to search for them. They found you, or more precisely, you stumbled into them because they were occupying the same spaces, eating the same plant foods your people gathered. Predators, on the other hand, are elusive. They have to be. Their survival depends on not being detected. They space themselves out across enormous territories. A wolf pack might range across 50 square miles. A pride of lions might control 100. That means you could walk for days without seeing a single predator, while encountering dozens of herbivores. So even before considering the danger or the lower caloric return, hunting predators just wasn't practical. They weren't available. The opportunity wasn't there. But humans being humans, we're adaptable, opportunistic, and sometimes circumstances change the equation. In some Arctic environments, where plant life was scarce and herbivore populations crashed during harsh winters, humans did hunt carnivores more regularly. Polar bear, Arctic fox, even wolves when necessary. But notice what's happening here. They weren't hunting predators because it was a good strategy. They were hunting predators because the better options had disappeared. Some coastal cultures developed traditions of eating shark, a top predator, but they weren't actively hunting them. They were taking sharks that came close to shore, that got caught in fish traps, that beached themselves. Low-risk opportunism, not systematic predator hunting. In parts of Asia, tigers and leopards were occasionally killed and eaten, but this was usually defensive or retaliatory, killing a predator that had killed livestock or people, and then eating it so the meat didn't go to waste. Not because cat meat was desirable, but because wasting protein was unthinkable. The pattern holds. Even when humans did eat predators, it was situational, opportunistic, never the primary strategy. And this makes perfect sense when you understand what your ancestors were actually trying to do. They weren't just hunting for sport or variety. They were trying to feed their families with the least risk and the maximum efficiency. Every hunting trip was a calculation. Every choice had consequences. Chase the wolves, and you might spend all day tracking them, risk injury in the confrontation, and end up with barely enough meat to justify the effort. Chase the reindeer, and you've got a proven strategy, better odds of success, and enough food to feed your entire band for a week if things go well. Generation after generation, the humans who made the smart choice, who focused on high-value herbivore prey, were the ones who survived and reproduced. The ones who wasted energy chasing predators went hungry more often, lost more hunters to injury, and eventually their genes dropped out of the pool. We are the descendants of the practical ones, the survivors who looked at a wolf and a reindeer and thought, quote, zero? That choice is embedded in our psychology now, so deep we don't even think about it. Walk into any butcher shop in the world and you won't see predator meat. Not because it's illegal, though sometimes it is, but because nobody wants it. Our ancestors made that choice 40,000 years ago, and we're still living with it. But there's more to this story. The decision to focus on herbivores wasn't just about calories and convenience. There were hidden dangers in predator meat that our ancestors didn't understand scientifically, but learned to avoid through hard experience. And those dangers are still relevant today. But there's another reason humans avoid eating predators. One that has nothing to do with energy efficiency and everything to do with poison. Not intentional poison, not venom or toxins the animal produced itself, but accumulated poison. Environmental contaminants that concentrate as they move up the food chain, turning apex predators into toxic time bombs. Biologists call this biomagnification, and it's one of nature's cruelest mathematical tricks. Here's how it works. Imagine a pesticide, doesn't matter which one, DDT, mercury, industrial chemicals, gets released into the environment. Maybe it's sprayed on crops, dumped in a river, released from a factory. The concentration seems trivial. Parts per million, parts per billion, barely detectable. No immediate threat to anything. But then algae absorb it. Not much, just traces. But algae don't break it down, don't excrete it. The toxin just sits there in their cells, then zooplankton eat the algae. Hundreds of algae per zooplankton, each one carrying its tiny load of poison. The toxin concentrates. Then small fish eat the zooplankton. Thousands of zooplankton per fish. The concentration increases again. Medium fish eat the small fish. Large fish eat the medium fish. And at each step the toxin concentration multiplies. By the time you reach the top predator, the concentration might be 1,000,000 times higher than the original environmental level. What started as parts per billion becomes parts per thousand. What was harmless becomes lethal. The classic example is DDT and bald eagles, a case that changed environmental policy forever. In the 1950s and 60s, DDT was the miracle pesticide. It killed mosquitoes, protected crops, seemed totally safe. Scientists sprayed it everywhere. Concentration in the environment was minimal. Nobody worried about it. Then bald eagle populations collapsed, not from direct poisoning, something more insidious. The DDT was accumulating in their bodies, concentrating with each fish they ate, and it was doing something subtle and devastating. It was interfering with calcium metabolism. Female eagles were laying eggs, but the shells were too thin. They cracked under the mother's weight during incubation. Entire generations failed to hatch. By the early 1970s, there were fewer than 500 breeding pairs of bald eagles left in the continental United States. The national symbol was going extinct, killed by a chemical that seemed perfectly safe at environmental concentrations. But here's the thing. The fish the eagles were eating weren't dying. The medium-sized predators that ate smaller fish were mostly fine. Only the apex predators, the ones at the very top of the food chain, were being devastated, because only in their bodies had the toxin concentrated enough to cause harm. The same principle explains why pregnant women are warned against eating tuna. Not salmon, not sardines, not most other fish. Tuna. Specifically the large predatory species like bluefin and albacore. They're apex predators of the ocean, and they're full of mercury. Not because they live in mercury-contaminated water, but because they eat fish that eat smaller fish that absorb mercury from the environment. By the time it reaches tuna muscle tissue, the concentration is high enough to damage fetal nervous systems. Our ancestors didn't know about biomagnification. They didn't have chemistry or toxicology, but they didn't need them. They had something better. Direct observation over thousands of generations. When people ate predators regularly, some got sick. Not immediately, not obviously, but over time. Weakness, neurological problems, reproductive issues. Patterns emerged. Taboos developed. Don't eat the big fish. Don't eat the bear liver. Don't eat the wolf. These weren't superstitions. They were survival strategies encoded in culture because they kept people alive. The Inuit people of the Arctic developed elaborate rules about polar bear consumption. They ate the meat sparingly, but the liver was absolutely forbidden. Violating this taboo could cause violent illness, sometimes death. Western explorers learned this the hard way. Early Arctic expeditions lost men to polar bear liver poisoning, suffering from hypervitaminosis A, toxic accumulations of vitamin A that cause liver failure, neurological damage, and death. The polar bear's liver accumulated vitamin A from eating seals, which got it from eating fish, which got it from eating smaller fish and crustaceans. Biomagnification again. But the indigenous people figured this out empirically, through terrible trial and error over generations, and encoded the solution in taboo. But toxins aren't the only thing that accumulates in predator flesh. Parasites love predators, because predators are the end point, the final host in complex life cycles that can involve multiple species. Consider trichinella, the parasite that causes trichinosis. Its preferred habitat is predator muscle tissue. Bears, wild boar, big cats. The parasite larvae encyst in muscle, waiting to be eaten by another predator. When that happens, they mature in the predator's gut, reproduce, and send their offspring to encyst in the muscle tissue, waiting for the next predator. Humans eating predator meat become accidental participants in this cycle. The larvae move into human muscle tissue, causing fever, muscle pain, and potentially fatal complications. Historically, trichinosis from bear meat was common enough that many cultures developed specific cooking requirements for predator flesh. Long, thorough cooking, nothing raw, nothing rare. Because heat is the only thing that kills the encysted larvae. Then there are prions, not alive, not quite. Misfolded proteins that cause other proteins to misfold. They accumulate in nervous tissue, especially brain and spinal cord. And they're found disproportionately in predators and scavengers. Mad cow disease is the famous example, but it's actually a predator problem that jumped to herbivores when humans forced cattle to eat rendered animal products. The natural reservoir for prion diseases is in predators and scavengers, who eat nervous tissue from their prey, chronic wasting disease in deer and elk, scrapie in sheep. These conditions exist at low levels in wild populations, and predators who eat infected animals accumulate prions in their own nervous tissue. Human populations that practiced ritual cannibalism learned this lesson brutally. The 4 people of Papua New Guinea developed kuru, a prion disease, from eating the brains of deceased relatives. It caused progressive neurological degeneration and death. The practice stopped in the 1960s, but cases of kuru continued for decades because prion diseases can incubate for 50 years or more. This is why virtually every human culture that eats animals has taboos about consuming brain, spinal cord, or eyes from predators. The risk is simply too high. Even modern food safety regulations acknowledge this. In countries with any history of prion disease, nervous tissue from cattle over 30 months old cannot enter the food supply. The mathematical probability of prion accumulation is too great. And then there's the taste problem, something nobody talks about but everyone notices. Predator meat tastes wrong. Not just different, wrong. There's a reason, quote, one is a euphemism for, quote, two. That strong, almost metallic flavor that makes predator flesh unappealing compared to herbivore meat. Part of this is diet. An animal's flesh tastes like what it eats. Herbivores eat plants. Their fat, their muscle tissue, it all has relatively neutral flavors. But predators eat flesh. Their bodies are full of breakdown products from animal protein. Urea, ammonia, other nitrogenous compounds. Their fat is saturated with lipid-soluble compounds from their prey. All of this creates flavors that human taste buds recognize on some deep level as warning signs, because our taste receptors evolved to detect potential dangers. Bitterness warns of plant toxins, sourness indicates spoilage, and that distinctive predator taste, that gamey quality, it signals accumulated compounds that might be harmful. Our ancestors who found predator meat unpalatable were slightly more likely to avoid it, slightly more likely to survive. Over hundreds of thousands of generations, this preference was refined. This is why cultures that do eat predators developed elaborate preparation techniques. Long marinades to leach out unpleasant compounds, heavy spicing to mask flavors, specific cuts that minimize the gamey taste. These aren't refinements for pleasure. They're survival strategies, cultural solutions to biological problems. The Sami people of northern Europe, who historically ate bear, developed multi-day preparation processes. The meat was aged in specific ways, marinated in particular solutions, cooked with herbs that had antimicrobial properties. This wasn't ritual, this was chemistry. Cultural knowledge that encoded practical solutions to the problems of eating an apex predator. So when you walk through a grocery store and see beef, chicken, pork, lamb, but no wolf steaks, no cougar cutlets, no bear roasts, you're seeing the cumulative result of millions of years of evolutionary pressure and thousands of years of cultural learning. We're avoiding predator meat not just because it's energetically inefficient, but because it's biologically dangerous in ways our ancestors couldn't articulate, but definitely experienced. Every toxin that enters the food chain concentrates in predator flesh. Every parasite that uses predators as hosts. Every accumulated compound that signals danger to our taste receptors. All of it adds up to one simple conclusion. Predators are terrible food, not just expensive, not just inefficient, actually dangerous. And we figured this out long before we understood why. Picture a village 10,000 years ago at the edge of a river valley, mud houses, smoke rising from cooking fires, fields of grain just starting to turn golden, and tied up just outside the village, goats, maybe a few sheep. If you're in Asia, maybe cattle that look more like wild aurochs than modern cows. If you're in the Americas, llamas or alpacas. But notice what's missing. no cages full of wolves, no lion corrals, no carefully bred cheetahs lined up like racehorses. Across the entire planet, whenever humans made the jump from hunting to herding, we made the same basic choice. We domesticated herbivores and a few opportunistic omnivores, animals that eat grass, leaves, seeds and scraps, animals that take low-quality plant calories and turn them into meat, milk and fat. Why? Because long before anyone could write the words trophic level or 10% energy rule, our ancestors were doing the math in blood, sweat and starvation. Look at the roll call of major domesticated animals. It's almost comically one-sided. Cows, sheep, goats, all herbivores. Horses, donkeys, camels. Herbivores, used for transport, war and work. Llamas, alpacas, yaks, water buffalo. Herbivores again. Chickens, ducks, geese. Technically omnivores, but they mostly turn seeds and bugs into edible protein. Pigs, omnivores that love roots, scraps, and anything vaguely edible, from acorns to leftover porridge. When humans bet their survival on animal agriculture, we overwhelmingly chose species that sit low on the food chain, species that eat the stuff we can't or won't eat, and then upgrade it for us. Now imagine the alternate universe. You walk through that same early village, and instead of cattle, there are fenced enclosures full of leopards, packs of domesticated hyenas pacing behind wooden palisades, a breeding program for crocodiles in mud ponds next to the grain fields. It sounds like the setup for a horror movie, but set aside the danger for a second, and just look at the energy economics. That leopard has to eat something, and it's not grass. Every predator is sitting at the top of a biological pyramid. For a carnivore to gain 1 calorie, its prey had to eat about 10. The plants at the bottom needed around 100. That's the 10% energy rule in action. At each step up the chain, 90% of the energy is lost as heat, movement, waste, and basic survival. Now take that logic and apply it to farming. Suppose you have enough land to grow plants that capture 100,000 calories of sunlight in a year. If you let cows or goats graze that land, maybe you end up with around 10,000 calories of edible meat and milk. Not perfect. There are losses, inefficiencies, but it roughly tracks the 10% rule. Now try to farm a predator on that same base. Your lions, wolves, or crocodiles would be eating herbivores. Those herbivores still only pass on about 10% of their calories. So by the time the lion turns its food into lion flesh, you're down another order of magnitude. Out of those original 100,000 plant calories, you're lucky to get 1,000 calories of lion meat. Same land, same sunlight, 10 times less food. Raise cows, feed a village, raise lions, feed a family. Maybe, that's the brutal math. The higher up the food chain you farm, the more land, water and time you burn per edible calorie. You're running your entire food system through a biological shredder. And the problems stack. To farm a lion, you don't just need plants. You need an entire mini ecosystem full of prey animals, which means more fields, more grazing land, more water. Now multiply that by every predator you want to raise. Very quickly, the land area you'd need balloons out to something absurd. In rough terms, if a cow needs X amount of pasture, a lion that lives off cow-sized prey needs something closer to 10x of plant productivity spread across its prey base. To actually farm that lion, not just hunt it in the wild, you'd be dedicating huge amounts of land to grow the plants that feed the animals that feed the lion that feeds you. It's like deciding to run your house on electricity generated by a generator that powers another generator that finally powers your light bulb. You can do it. But why would you? Our ancestors didn't know the physics, but they could count. They could see that a herd of goats turned scrubby hillsides into milk, meat and hides year after year. They could see that if you kept pigs near your home, they turned garbage, acorns and crop leftovers into fat and bacon. They could see that birds scratching in the yard transform spilled grain and insects into eggs on a near-daily basis. Try that with a leopard. And yet, there are a few carnivores we farm today. They're just not the ones you picture on the savannah. Think of salmon, tuna, trout, carnivorous fish. Modern aquaculture does sometimes raise fish that eat other fish or high-protein feed. But look closer at the economics. For decades, farming carnivorous fish meant grinding up wild fish, anchovies, sardines, other small species, into fish meal and fish oil. We take wild herbivorous or low-level omnivorous fish and run them through an industrial blender to feed farmed predators. Energetically, this is the same old problem. You're compressing a wild marine food web into pellets, then burning most of that energy again as your farm salmon swim, digest, and grow. This is one reason why traditional carnivorous fish farming has a big environmental footprint. It sits high on the trophic ladder, where energy is inherently scarce and expensive. Only with careful feed reformulation, replacing fish meal with plant proteins and insect meal, do we start to claw back some efficiency. In other words, even when we do farm carnivores, we're constantly trying to drag them down the energy pyramid, feeding them like herbivores in disguise. So why did chickens, pigs, and cattle become the planetary superstars of meat production? Chickens are tiny energy converters. Give them grains, bugs, kitchen scraps, and they'll turn it into eggs and meat at astonishing speeds. A hen can lay hundreds of eggs a year. That's hundreds of dense little nutrient packages built mostly out of seeds and invertebrates we don't want to eat. They grow fast, breed quickly, and don't need much space. From an energy standpoint, chickens are one of the most efficient links between plants and human mouths. Pigs are the ultimate recyclers. In traditional farming systems, they sweep up what nothing else wants: peels, spoiled grain, byproducts from brewing or tofu making, fallen fruit, even bones. They can live on what would otherwise rot. You're not just feeding pigs, you're compressing waste streams back into usable calories. Energetically, that's huge. You're recovering energy that would have been lost entirely. Cattle sit on land we often can't use for crops: steep hillsides, semi-arid grasslands, cold pastures. They eat cellulose we can't digest and turn it into protein and fat. In environments where humans can't grow dense crops, herbivores are the only way to turn wild plant biomass into something we can eat. That's why pastoralism, herding cattle, sheep and goats, spread across huge swathes of Africa, Asia and Europe. It wasn't sentiment, it was energy logic. As agriculture scaled up into industrial farming, that same logic stayed in charge, but it got sharper, harsher, and more mechanized. Modern feedlots, chicken barns, and pig operations are essentially giant machines for maximizing energy transfer from plants to people. We breed animals to grow faster, put on more muscle, and convert feed more efficiently. We optimize diet so that as many calories as possible go into edible tissue instead of bone, fur, or wandering around. We control temperature, light, disease. In energy terms, we're trying to minimize every leak in the system. You can see the shadow of the 10% rule in every spreadsheet used by an agribusiness company. Feed conversion ratios, growth curves, carcass yield. It's not framed as ecology, but it's the same equation. How much plant energy goes in, how much edible meat comes out, how much is lost along the way. And this brings us to a new frontier in the domestication story: alternative proteins. If herbivores are more efficient than carnivores, what's more efficient than herbivores? Plants themselves. When you eat beans, lentils, or tofu, you're only one step above the grass in the energy pyramid. There's no cow or pig standing between you and the sun. The losses are smaller. This is why, calorie for calorie, plant-based diets generally require less land, less water, and less overall energy input than heavy meat diets. You've shortened the chain. Insects offer another path. Many insect species are ultra-efficient at turning plant waste or low-value biomass into protein. They're small, cold-blooded, and don't spend energy keeping themselves warm. In terms of raw energy transfer, a cricket farm looks a lot more like a hyper-efficient herbivore herd than a pride of lions. Even lab-grown meat, if it ever scales economically, is basically an attempt to sidestep all the energy waste of running a full animal with bones, brains, immune systems, and constant movement. You feed cells directly and ask them to build muscle. No hooves, no horns, no wandering across pastures. In theory, you're rewiring the energy pathway to remove as many losses as possible. All of these experiments, beans, bugs, bioreactors, are really just different ways of asking the same ancient question. How do we get the most edible energy out of the least land, time, and risk? 10,000 years ago, our ancestors answered that question by putting ropes around goats instead of leopards. They didn't have spreadsheets or ecological models, but they had something even more unforgiving: survival tests that ran for generations. Any community that tried to live off domesticated predators would have been outcompeted, starved out, or simply wiped away by the math. The domestication revolution wasn't just about taming animals, it was about aligning human culture with the hidden arithmetic of the food chain. Herbivores won, predators lost, not because we liked cows more than lions, but because the universe charges a brutal energy tax on every step up the ladder. And when your entire civilization depends on how much food you can squeeze out of a patch of land, you don't argue with that tax, you build your world around it. So if the 10% rule makes predator meat such a bad deal, why do some people do it anyway? Why is there shark fin on banquet tables in East Asia, bear meat in Siberian stew pots, crocodile on grills in parts of Africa and Australia? If eating predators is such a losing strategy, how did any of these habits survive? Because evolution doesn't care about rules in the abstract. It cares about situations, and in some situations the cost-benefit math flips just enough that humans push up the food chain, even if only a little, even if only sometimes. Start with one of the harshest test cases on Earth, the Arctic. Picture a landscape where plants barely exist. No wheat fields, no fruit trees, no lush pastures, just ice, snow, lichens clinging to rock, brief flashes of tundra grass in a summer that feels more like a pause in winter than a real season. If you want calories here, you have to take them from animals. There is no plan B. That's the world of the Inuit and other Arctic peoples. And in that world, the 10% rule still applies. But the options are different. You can't farm cows when there's no grass. You can't rely on nuts and berries when the growing season is a few frantic weeks. So they went where the energy already was: seals, whales, walruses, and sometimes land predators like polar bears. Massive animals, living off oceans that had done the hard work of capturing sunlight thousands of kilometers away. Hunter-gatherers in temperate regions could afford to be picky. They could choose the herbivores and leave the carnivores alone. Arctic hunters didn't have that luxury. If a polar bear shows up near your camp, that's not just a threat, it's several 100,000 calories on legs. Meat, fat, organs, skin, tools, clothing. In a place where a missed hunt can mean death, passing that up would be its own kind of suicide. But even here, notice the pattern. Bears are not everyday food. They're rare, dangerous, and often surrounded by taboos. Many Inuit traditions treat polar bear hunts with intense ritual. Specific people can eat specific parts. Certain organs are avoided, or fed only to sled dogs. Knowledge about which tissues are toxic, which parasites to watch for, which cooking methods are safest. That's all cultural armour against the downsides of eating a top predator. The 10% rule didn't vanish in the Arctic. People just found themselves in a corner of the world where the usual rules about what's efficient had to bend around What's possible? Move south to boreal forests and mountain ranges where bears also live, and you see a different pattern. Siberian hunters, some North American indigenous groups, rural communities in parts of Japan and Eastern Europe. Many of them have traditions of eating bear, sometimes for pure survival during lean times, sometimes for prestige, sometimes as a side effect of killing a competitor for the same prey. Bear meat is calorie-dense, especially the fat, but it comes with a price tag. Trichinella parasites, bioaccumulated toxins, unpredictable flavor. In a lot of cultures, bear isn't an everyday staple. It's a rare, risky, often ceremonial food, something you talk about, not something you build a cuisine around. Sharks tell a similar story, but in a different environment. Imagine sailing for days on open ocean. No land, no farms. Your calories come from below the surface or not at all. If a giant shark appears, you're not looking at an abstract trophic level problem. You're looking at food, muscle, oil, cartilage, energy. Across the Pacific and Indian Oceans, traditional fishing cultures did sometimes eat shark. But again, note the pattern. Shark is often special, not standard. In parts of Polynesia, shark meat was reserved for high-status individuals. In Japan, some shark species were seen as emergency food for poor communities. In many Chinese coastal areas, the body of the shark might be eaten when caught, but the fins, the least calorically useful part, became symbols of wealth and status in shark fin soup. From a 10% perspective, this is almost darkly funny. The least efficient meat source in the ocean becomes a status dish whose main function is not nutrition but signaling. You're not eating shark fin because it's an energy bargain. You're eating it to show you can afford to waste energy. Modern exotic meat markets have extended this pattern. In upscale restaurants and tourist traps around the world, you can find lion burgers, crocodile skewers, alligator sausage, snake wine, even canned tiger meat in some black markets. These are not feeding the masses, they're feeding something else. The human craving to feel special, powerful, adventurous. Predator meat survives in the modern world as a novelty, a dare, a luxury. The ecological math never went away. We just stepped outside of it temporarily because fossil fuels and industrial agriculture flooded us with cheap herbivore calories. When you're surrounded by $5 chicken and subsidized beef, you can afford to turn a top predator into a conversation piece. But there's another set of predators we eat all the time without thinking twice, without any of the drama. Think about your last seafood platter: shrimp, crab, lobster, maybe a nice fillet of cod or salmon. In the ocean, almost everything is eating something else. Those shrimp, many are small predators, vacuuming up worms, tiny crustaceans, eggs, larvae. Crabs are omnivorous opportunists, happy to tear apart anything they can catch. Cod and many white fish species are voracious hunters of smaller fish and invertebrates. Salmon spend much of their lives as predators in open water, chasing down schooling fish. We don't frame them as meat eaters because they're small or live underwater, but trophically, a lot of the seafood aisle sits significantly above plants. So why does this feel different than lion steaks? Because the ocean's energy pyramid is built on a ridiculous base. Phytoplankton and algae capture sunlight on a scale that makes terrestrial grasslands look like houseplants. Those microscopic primary producers feed vast swarms of zooplankton, which feed small fish, which feed bigger fish, which feed the salmon and cod on your plate. The 10% rule still applies, but when the pyramid is that wide at the bottom, a few steps up can still support enormous biomass. You can have thriving fisheries of mid-level predators because the ocean's base productivity is massive and more continuous than most land systems. Humans tap into that mid to upper range. Shrimp, crabs, many fish species, without collapsing the entire food web immediately. Overfish it long enough and you will. But that's a different part of the story. Reptiles add yet another wrinkle. Travel through parts of the American South and you'll find alligator on menus. Head into West and Central Africa and crocodile shows up in markets. In Southeast Asia, monitor lizards, snakes and crocodiles appear in traditional dishes. Some Amazonian groups will eat caiman when the opportunity arises. Most of these animals are predators, or at least active hunters. Yet again, they rarely become the main pillar of any cuisine. They're used as supplemental proteins, seasonal opportunities, prestige foods, or things you eat when nothing else is available. Flavor is often described as like fishy chicken, or like tough pork. Not so mind-blowing that it overrides the energy cost argument. And tucked in here is another subtle point. In many of these cultures, people also eat herbivores when they can. The presence of crocodile or snake on the menu doesn't mean these societies rejected the 10% logic. It usually means they're in ecosystems where reptiles are abundant, relatively easy to catch in certain seasons, or dangerous enough that killing them is already part of staying alive. If you have to remove a crocodile that preys on your goats, burning it would be a waste. Eating it is just closing the loop. So why didn't any of these predator foods ever go fully mainstream, become the cows, pigs, and chickens of civilization? Several reasons stack together. First, efficiency. You can domesticate a herbivore, feed it plants humans can't digest, and turn that into milk, muscle, manure, and labor. Try that with lions or sharks. Predators need high-quality food. To raise them at scale, you'd have to feed them other animals that you could have just eaten yourself. Every step up the chain is a loss. In a pre-industrial world where every calorie of labor matters, that's economic suicide. Second, risk. Predators fight back. They bite, scratch, maim, and kill. A species you can herd, milk, and pen is a much safer long-term investment than one that sees you as either a rival or prey. Herbivores can panic and trample you, sure, but they don't stalk you. Third, disease and toxins. Meat-eaters run higher risks of harbouring parasites that are well adapted to mammalian or avian bodies. They sit at the end of bioaccumulation chains, especially in modern polluted environments. Bears with high mercury loads from fish, sharks packed with heavy metals, large reptiles carrying parasites and toxins from everything they've eaten. Over generations, cultures notice patterns. That meat makes you sick more often. Those patterns become taboos, stories, religious rules. Fourth, predictability. Herbivores can be fenced, bred, counted. You can plan your harvests. Predators are solitary, territorial, wide-ranging. Their populations boom and bust with the health of entire ecosystems. You can't build stable cities on a food supply that disappears every time the local fish stocks dip or the deer population crashes. Finally, culture. Once agriculture took off, the societies that leaned into herbivore domestication and plant cultivation could support larger, more stable populations. Their cuisines solidified around grains, beans, and docile meat. Predator eating survived in the margins. Extreme climates, frontier economies, ritual exceptions, luxury markets, but it never formed the backbone of a civilization. In other words, the exceptions actually highlight the rule. When humans do eat predators, it's almost always because of necessity, symbolism, or curiosity, not because it's a good energy deal. The 10% rule is still there in the background, shaping what's easy, what's profitable, what scales. We can defy it temporarily, hedge around it, or turn it into a spectacle for adventurous diners. But build a whole food system on meat-eaters. Our ancestors tried the math, even if only unconsciously, and walked away. And the deeper you look at our plates, at what we eat casually, what we eat only on dares, and what we never even think of as predators, the more you start to see that invisible arithmetic running underneath everything. Now, zoom out. Forget for a second about humans, predators, grocery stores, ethics. Imagine you're looking at Earth the way an alien ecologist might. No borders, no countries, just flows of energy. Sunlight hits the planet. Plants catch a tiny fraction of it. Animals eat the plants. Other animals eat those animals. At every step, about 90% of the energy vanishes into heat, movement, waste, and survival costs. Only around 10% makes it into the next body up the chain. That simple leak, that constant loss, quietly writes the rules for everything alive. It decides how many predators an ecosystem can support, how tall forests grow, where deserts form, how many humans can stand on the planet without collapsing everything underneath us. And it explains why food chains nearly always hit a hard ceiling. Think about a classic food chain. Grass arrow antelopes arrow lions. The grass captures sunlight. The antelope converts some of that plant energy into muscle and fat. The lion converts some of that antelope into its own body. Each step loses roughly 90% of the original energy. If 10,000 units of energy fall as sunlight, maybe 1,000 become plant tissue. Around 100 become antelope meat. Only about 10 become lion. By the time you've gone plant, herbivore, carnivore, you're already down to crumbs. Try to add another level. Say, something that eats lions. Now you're down to 1 unit of usable energy. You can't build many bodies out of that. Not big ones, not stable populations. The whole thing starts to wobble. That's why most real-world food chains don't go on forever. Not because nature lacks imagination, but because the math refuses. On land, you almost never see more than 4 or 5 trophic levels. Plants, plant-eaters, mid-level predators, top predators, and then scavengers and decomposers recycling the leftovers. You can stretch that a bit in the deep ocean, where energy pathways get weird and complicated, but even there, you eventually smash into the same wall. The 10% rule. Energy losses stack, every extra step is another tax. And after a few steps, there's nothing left to tax. This is why top predators are always rare. Not sometimes, not usually. Structurally, mathematically, they have to be. There just isn't enough energy in the system to support millions of tigers, or oceans of sharks, or prairies full of wolves. For every lion you get on the savannah, you need thousands of antelopes, and for every antelope you need a carpet of plants. The higher you sit, the thinner the air gets. Now put humans back into the picture. For most of our history, we behaved like a mixed-feeding omnivore somewhere in the middle of the web. A bit of hunting, a lot of gathering, scavenging when we could, opportunistically bumping our way up and down the chain depending on luck and season. Then something happened that broke the old energy logic. We stopped just participating in food webs and started redesigning them. When we invented agriculture, we hacked the 10% rule in a very specific way. We didn't make it go away. We simply started rigging the system so more of each 10% slice ended up in our mouths instead of in other species. Look at a wheat field from space, or a cornfield, or a rice paddy. What you're seeing is a hijacked ecosystem, land that might have supported a whole web of plants, insects, birds, reptiles, and mammals has been simplified into 1 or 2 species, plus humans. Instead of wild herbivores eating those plants, we harvest the plants directly. Instead of letting predators eat the herbivores, we become the predator. Or we domesticate the herbivores and eat them ourselves later on our schedule. Every time we eat plants directly, we're acting as primary consumers. We're harvesting that first 10% from the plants themselves. Every time we eat beef or pork or chicken, we're mostly eating at the next level up and paying the 90% energy tax that comes with it. This is why you can feed far more humans per acre with grains, beans, and vegetables than with cows. The 10% rule isn't a vegan slogan, it's just physics. When humans discovered farming and then scaled it up, We were effectively doing something the post-bottleneck humans did when they spilled out of Africa, exploiting a suddenly rich environment with new tools and social coordination. Only this time, the environment wasn't a recovering grassland. It was the entire biosphere. We planted more. We cleared forests. We irrigated deserts. We learned to store energy as grain, as fat on livestock, as fermented foods. We bypassed nature's normal checks on population by converting entire landscapes into extended human stomachs. Energy that would have gone into wild food webs was diverted into human ones. The result was explosive population growth. Just like after that ancient climate bottleneck, when a few thousand survivors became millions, agriculture let a few million scattered foragers become billions of farmers, city dwellers, and industrial workers. It's the same story at a different scale. More controlled energy, more bodies, more energy, more complexity, more energy, more everything. But there's a catch. You can't cheat the 10% rule. You can only move the losses around. When we produce industrial meat, we're essentially building giant machine-assisted herbivores and predators. We grow plants with fossil fuel fertilizers, feed those plants to animals, process the animals in factories, refrigerate their bodies, ship them across continents, and cook them with electricity or gas. Each of those steps leaks energy. Each step adds another tax. By the time a steak lands on your dinner plate, it carries a long, invisible trail of burned fuel, cleared land, lost biodiversity, and wasted calories. That's why our position in the modern food web is so environmentally heavy. We're not just one more predator on top of a natural pyramid. We're a super predator sitting on top of an artificial mountain of energy we assembled ourselves, and the planet is feeling the cost. When we clear a forest to grow soy to feed cows, we're flattening a complex multi-level food web into a crude, two-step funnel: sunlight, soy, cattle, humans. The thousands of species that used to share that sunlight are gone. The predators that depended on them vanish. The decomposers that recycled them lose their jobs. The whole local energy network collapses into a single pipe pointed at us. Scale that up across continents and you get the modern world. Vast zones of high-intensity human food production, feeding cities that behave, ecologically, like giant carnivores. Lots of mouths at the upper levels, supported by stripped-down, simplified energy pathways below. This is one of the hidden engines of climate change. We burn fossil fuels to power tractors, produce fertilizers, pump irrigation water, run processing plants. We dedicate huge areas of land to feed animals that feed us, losing 90% of the energy at each jump. We let methane leak from cattle and rice paddies. We destroy forests that were storing carbon and capturing sunlight in incredibly efficient, complex webs. All of that is the 10% rule made visible on a planetary scale. Energy moves. Most of it is lost as heat and waste. The more steps we add, the more we burn, the more we waste, the more we heat the planet. Understanding this isn't just an academic exercise. It points directly toward what sustainable food choices actually mean in the real, physical world. Eating lower on the food chain, more plants, fewer animal products, cuts out a whole trophic level or two. That's not a moral argument, it's an efficiency argument. Less energy lost between sun and stomach means less land, less fertilizer, less water, fewer emissions. You're not changing the rules, you're just playing them closer to the ground where the numbers still work. Supporting farming systems that mimic ecosystems rather than bulldozing them, polycultures, agroforestry, regenerative grazing, can rebuild some of the lost complexity. More species, more stable nutrient cycles, multiple mini-food webs stacked on the same patch of land, with humans as one participant instead of the only winner. Even small shifts matter, swapping a few meat-heavy meals for plant-centered ones, choosing chicken instead of beef, eggs instead of steak. All of that is quietly moving your personal energy footprint down a level or two in the web. But there's another possibility on the horizon, a wild one. What if we didn't need animals at all to get meat? Lab-grown meat, cultured meat, cellular agriculture, whatever you want to call it, is an attempt to break one of nature's implicit assumptions that if you want muscle, you first have to build an animal. Right now, to get a cow steak, nature requires you to feed a cow for years. You spend enormous energy building bones, brain, immune system, hooves, behavior, an entire living, breathing organism just to eventually carve off a few muscles. Cultured meat says, what if we skip that? What if we feed nutrients directly to muscle cells in a bioreactor? No hooves, no horns, no nervous system, no predator, just tissue. In theory, this could sidestep some of the 10% losses. Not the basic thermodynamic ones. You still have to grow plants somewhere to feed those cells. But many of the biological overhead costs, movement, body heat, reproduction, immune defenses. You're not running a whole animal. You're running a controlled growth machine. If that technology matures, it could do something radical to the global food web. It could pull humans partially out of the role of top predator and move us into something stranger. Direct managers of energy flow. Imagine fields of high-yield crops feeding not animals but bioreactors. Imagine oceans with recovering fish populations because our demand for wild-caught protein has dropped. Imagine forests regrowing because we no longer need as much pasture. Will it work at scale? Nobody knows yet. The early versions are energy-hungry and expensive. The 10% rule still lurks in the background, demanding its tax in electricity infrastructure and raw materials. Maybe we just end up trading one set of inefficiencies for another. But the idea alone shows how deeply this simple rule has burrowed into our future. Even our most advanced food technologies are really about the same basic question. How do we move energy from sun to human with less waste, fewer steps, and less damage? From ancient grasslands to modern megacities, from wild wolves to feedlot cattle, to hypothetical meat factories, the logic hasn't changed. Every bite is a decision about where you want to sit in the global energy pyramid, and how much of the world you're willing to burn to sit there, past your dinner plate, past farms and forests, past the whole planet, out to the level where everything you've ever eaten, every predator that has ever lived, every leaf on every tree, is just one way the universe moves energy downhill. Because that's what this all comes back to, thermodynamics, not in the textbook sense of equations and symbols, but in the blunt, unforgiving reality that every living thing is trapped inside the same cosmic accounting system. And the 10% rule, the reason you don't eat lions, is just the way that accounting shows up in ecology. Here's the core of it. The universe has rules about energy. You can't create it, you can't destroy it, but every time you use it, every time energy gets transformed, some of it becomes useless for doing more work. It leaks out as heat, as randomness, as what physicists call entropy. Life is the art of fighting that drift into disorder, temporarily, locally, by burning through huge amounts of energy. A cell has to pump ions, a muscle has to contract, a brain has to fire signals. All of that is energy being spent to hold off chaos for just a little longer, but the bill for that spending is always the same. You lose some energy as heat, and you can never get it back. The 10% rule, only about 10% of the energy in one trophic level making it to the next, is just entropy in biological clothing. Plants capture sunlight, but most of that energy keeps them alive. Only a fraction goes into new leaves, roots, seeds, the stuff herbivores can eat. Herbivores do the same, so do carnivores. By the time you get up to top predators, almost everything has been spent. From the universe's perspective, A meat-eating animal is an extremely expensive machine for taking sunlight, running it through several rounds of digestion, movement, and metabolism, and then finally radiating it out into space as heat. It's beautiful, but it's wasteful. It has to be. That's why there are always fewer predators than prey. That's why predator populations are fragile, unstable, easily wiped out. And that's why, when your ancestors were deciding what was worth hunting, capturing, breeding, and feeding, they almost never picked carnivores. The universe had already made that decision for them. But this isn't just about early farmers and missing lion steaks. This energy ladder has been shaping life on Earth from the very beginning. Go back billions of years. The first organisms were basically tiny chemical parasites on geological energy gradients, feeding on heat from vents, on simple molecules, on whatever energy they could scrape from a hostile planet. Then photosynthesis evolved, and suddenly Earth had a new way to tap into the cosmic energy budget: sunlight. Plants and algae turned photons into chemical bonds. They became the base of almost every food web. Everything else, directly or indirectly, hooked into that stream. Once you have primary producers, the rest of the pyramid is basically inevitable. Organisms will evolve to eat them. Other organisms will evolve to eat those. Predators will appear, then bigger predators, then specialists that only eat certain kinds of prey. But the 10% rule keeps pulling everyone back to reality. Pyramids get tall enough and then stop because there simply isn't enough energy left at the top to support more tiers. That constraint has written itself into the history of life. It limits the size of ecosystems, the number of species they can support, how big animals can get, how many top predators can exist at once. It even shapes evolution itself. Traits that save energy, better insulation, more efficient muscles, smarter foraging strategies get rewarded. Traits that waste too much energy get erased. If you replayed Earth's history from scratch, over and over, the exact species would change. No lions, maybe, no humans, but you'd still get something like the 10% rule. You'd still get energy pyramids. You'd still get a world where top predators are rare, expensive, and fragile. And you'd still get the same basic logic. Eating predators is a luxury, not a strategy. The math just doesn't work. For almost all of Earth's history, every organism was completely trapped by that math. You could move around within the rules, become more efficient, find new food sources, cooperate, migrate, but you could never step outside the system. Then, recently, and by recently we mean the last few tens of thousands of years, one species started to cheat. Your species. Humans did something no other animal has done at scale. We figured out how to tap into energy flows we didn't evolve for. Fire let us unlock calories from foods that would otherwise be barely edible. Cooking meat and roots effectively gave us more than 10% of what we were eating, because we were doing some of the digestion outside the body. Later, agriculture let us compress huge amounts of solar energy into fields of grain and herds of herbivores. We weren't just hunting what nature provided anymore. We were engineering the base of the pyramid, ploughing, irrigating, fertilizing, breeding, to maximize the amount of energy that ended up in human mouths, not in wild ecosystems. And then came the real break with the past. Fossil fuels. Coal, oil, natural gas. They're just ancient sunlight stored in the bodies of long-dead organisms, concentrated over hundreds of millions of years. When we started burning them, we weren't just living off this year's crop of photons. We were tapping into a planetary savings account that had taken geological ages to build. Tractors, fertilizers made from natural gas, refrigerated ships full of meat, factory farms, vertical greenhouses lit at midnight. All of that is us using fossilized sunlight to bend the old 10% rule in our favor. In natural ecosystems, maybe you can't push more than a certain amount of energy through a food chain before the system collapses. In an industrial food system, you can dump more energy in from outside and prop everything up. But that trick comes with its own bill. You don't get to escape thermodynamics. You just move the costs around. All that energy we burn to grow, cool, ship and process food doesn't disappear. It becomes heat, carbon dioxide, nitrogen runoff, collapsing fisheries, disappearing soils. Locally, we build an artificial pyramid where humans sit as super predators, eating both plants and animals at unprecedented scales. Globally, entropy keeps ticking upward, and the planet absorbs the shock. So here we are, a species smart enough to partially transcend the energy limits that shaped all life before us, but not smart enough, yet to avoid destabilizing the system that keeps us alive. Which raises a question. What does food look like in a future where we actually take this energy math seriously? Some possibilities are already on the table, literally. Plant-heavy diets are one obvious move. If you eat closer to the base of the pyramid, you waste less energy. Fewer steps between sunlight and your stomach means fewer losses at each stage. That doesn't mean no animal products ever. But it does mean the global norm of feeding huge amounts of grain to animals so we can eat their meat every day looks energetically absurd. Then there's technology that tries to rewire the pyramid entirely. Lab-grown meat skips the animal and grows muscle cells directly. Insect farming turns low-grade plant waste into protein more efficiently than cows or pigs. Precision fermentation uses microbes as tiny bioreactors, turning electricity and simple inputs into fats and proteins. Go further, and you get really weird. Imagine food systems where sunlight is captured by solar panels, turned into electricity, and then into chemical energy in vats where bacteria make everything from amino acids to vitamins. No fields, no herds. Just direct conversion of photons to food via human-designed pathways. In a sense, that's just us trying to build a better, tighter, less wasteful energy pyramid. Fewer leaks, fewer losses, less entropy pumped into the biosphere for every calorie we eat. But even in the most high-tech scenario you can dream up, the same rules are still there in the background. You can't make energy. You can't recycle it perfectly. You can only choose how to spend it and where you want the waste to show up. That's the philosophical gut punch of the 10% rule. It's not just an ecological curiosity. It's a reminder that everything about your life, what you eat, how you live, what kind of civilization you can build, is constrained by mathematics you never voted on. Your ancestors didn't sit down and calculate trophic efficiencies when they decided to domesticate sheep instead of hyenas. They felt the consequences in their stomachs, in their survival rates, in the stability of their villages. Predators were rare, dangerous, slow to grow, and energetically expensive. Herbivores were abundant, predictable, and convertible into milk, wool, labor, and meat. The universe had done the math. They just followed the results, and that brings us back to the original mystery. Why humans don't eat meat-eaters. The clues were always in front of you, in the shape of food webs, in the scarcity of apex predators, in the size of your grocery store's beef section compared to its exotic meats corner, in the way every ecosystem on Earth thins out as you go up the chain. You weren't looking at a gap in human culture. You were looking at the shadow of thermodynamics on your dinner plate. So now the question isn't, why don't we eat lions? You know that answer. The question is something much harder. Now that we understand the energy rules that built our world, and now that we're powerful enough to bend them, what kind of relationship with food and energy do we choose next? Picture this. You sit down to eat. Nothing dramatic, no ice age winds howling outside the cave, no saber-tooth lurking in the dark. Just you, a plate of food, maybe a screen glowing in front of you. It feels completely ordinary. But hidden in that moment is the same brutal arithmetic that shaped our ancestors, our civilizations, and the entire living world. Every bite on your plate is a receipt, not for dollars but for energy, and the numbers are ugly. That cow? It turned grass into muscle at maybe 10% efficiency. The grass turned sunlight into sugar at maybe 1% efficiency. By the time that steak gets to you, you're skimming the froth off the top of a long cascade of energy losses, and if you were eating a lion instead of a cow, you'd be skimming the froth off the froth. Predator-on-predator cuisine is like trying to live off the tips of the tips of the tips in a broken economy. Nature doesn't pay that bill. This is the quiet revelation behind everything we've been talking about. The 10% rule isn't just a biology fact buried in an ecology textbook. It's the hidden mathematics of your dinner plate. It decided which animals we domesticated and which ones stayed behind the bars of the zoo. It decided where cities could rise, how many people could live there, what empires could feed their armies, which cultures could spare minds for art, science, and philosophy instead of spending every waking hour hunting meat that was too expensive in energy terms to chase. Energy is the invisible currency of history. Our ancestors didn't sit around doing calculus about trophic levels, but their choices were being graded by physics all the same. Groups that tried to live too high on the food chain, chasing mostly predators, got hammered by the numbers. Long hunts, scarce prey, unstable returns. One bad season, and everyone starved. Groups that leaned into herbivores and plants, that figured out how to harvest the cheaper energy lower on the pyramid, could support more children, more elders, more specialists, farmers, potters, metal workers, storytellers, priests, scientists. Culture itself is what happens when energy becomes predictable enough that not everyone has to spend every day chasing calories. That's the real twist. The 10% rule didn't just shape food chains. It sculpted languages, myths, trade routes, war strategies. It's baked into which animals appear as gods and monsters, and which appear roasted on skewers. It's written into religious food taboos, famine stories, migration epics. Every civilization that ever existed had to negotiate with the same merciless equation. How far up the ladder can we eat before the energy debt breaks us? And you're still living inside that negotiation. When you pick chicken over beef or lentils over both, you're moving up and down that energy pyramid. When governments argue about land use and climate policy, they're really arguing about how much of the planet's photosynthesis budget we can afford to burn at each step of the food chain. When we talk about sustainable diets, planetary boundaries, and the future of 8 billion humans, we're talking about the 10% rule without saying its name. So next time you look at your dinner, burger, salad, sushi, whatever, pause for half a second. Ask, how many steps from sunlight is this? How many losses piled up to put this on my plate? How many alternate worlds vanished because the math of energy said no? Because once you see it, you can't unsee it. Your kitchen turns into a small, quiet battlefield of ecological decisions. Your fridge becomes a map of hidden power flows. Civilization shrinks down to something intimate. A fork, a plate, and a universe of physics humming underneath. If you want to keep exploring these hidden laws that quietly run your life, the energy math behind your food, your city, your species, make sure you hit like so YouTube knows to show you more of this kind of thing. Subscribe if you haven't already, and ring the bell so you don't miss the next dive into the secret rules of nature. I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Tell me where you're watching from, what country, what city, and how your local food culture fits into this story. What should we explore next? Street food economies? Sacred animals? Why some cultures lean so heavily on meat and others don't? Leave your questions and ideas below. A lot of future videos start right there. And if you want to go one step further, you can join our channel membership here on YouTube. It's totally optional, but it helps us spend more time on deep research, animations, and the kind of long-form stories most algorithms don't reward. If that's not for you, no worries at all. Just watching, liking, and sharing is already a huge help. Your dinner plate is not just food. It's a compressed history of sunlight, evolution, and human decision-making. And now that you know the math behind it, you're not just eating, you're reading the code.